Mussolini was born on the 29th of July, 1883, in a small village called Dovia di Predapio, tucked into the hills of the Emilia-Romagna region in central Italy. The Italy he entered was not yet a generation old. The Kingdom of Italy had only come into existence in 1861, stitched together from centuries of fragmented city-states and foreign-controlled territories, and the seams of that unification were still showing in ways that would shape the country's politics for decades to come. Italy in the 1880s was a nation caught between ambition and anxiety. It had territorial aspirations, a growing colonial presence in Africa, and a liberal political class that spoke proudly of progress and modernization. But beneath that surface, large parts of the country were desperately poor. Millions of Italians saw no future in their homeland at all, and somewhere in the region of 15 million of them would leave for the United States, Argentina, and other countries between 1861 and 1914. It was an indictment of a nation that had promised its people greatness and delivered them poverty instead. His father, Alessandro Mussolini, was a blacksmith by trade and a revolutionary by conviction. Alessandro had spent years in the orbit of radical socialist politics, had lived under a form of house arrest for his activities, and had emerged from that experience with his beliefs not weakened but hardened. The forge where he worked was also a classroom, and the ideas that filled it shaped his eldest son in ways that would take decades to fully reveal themselves. Father and son spent long hours debating socialism, anarchism, and the political currents sweeping through Europe, and the young Benito absorbed all of it with an appetite that showed no sign of being satisfied. His mother, Rosa Maltoni, was a schoolteacher and a devout woman. The contrast between her quiet faith and her husband's fierce politics created a household pulled in two very different directions at once. She named her son Benito after Benito Juarez, the Mexican president who had led his country's resistance against foreign domination. It was a name chosen with intention, carrying within it a vision of what a man could become when he stood against power and refused to yield. Two other children followed. A brother named Arnaldo arrived in 1885, and a sister named Edvige in 1888. The family was not wealthy, but it was intellectually alive in a way that set it apart from the surrounding village. Alessandro's politics made him a figure of both admiration and suspicion among his neighbors, and that tension between belonging and standing apart was something his eldest son would carry with him long after he left Predapio behind. From his earliest years, Mussolini was neither easy nor quiet. From his earliest years, Mussolini was violent, defiant, and impossible to discipline. He was expelled from his first school after stabbing a fellow student with a knife. His mother, desperate to find somewhere that could handle him, sent him to a school run by monks at Faenza. The monks could not manage him either. What some might romanticize as the restless energy of a gifted young man was, in practice, a pattern of aggression and disregard for anyone who stood in his way. It was a pattern that would never disappear. It would simply find a much larger stage. He was eventually sent to a secular school at Forlimpopoli, and it was there that something began to take shape. He graduated with a teaching diploma at just 18 years old, but the classroom was never going to hold him. He had no interest in educating children. What he was interested in was power, and he was already moving toward it with the single-minded focus of a man who had decided, early and with complete conviction, that the world owed him something far greater than a schoolteacher's salary. In the summer of 1902, he left Italy for Switzerland. He went officially to find work, and unofficially to escape military conscription and to follow the political currents that were pulling him forward with increasing force. Switzerland in those years was a crossing point for radicals, exiles, and agitators from across Europe. If you are enjoying this video, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for supporting this channel. Your like really helps keep this project alive. If you can, leave a super chat. Any amount will help us a lot. Thanks. Mussolini walked straight into that world and made himself at home in it immediately. He organized strikes, clashed repeatedly with Swiss authorities, and threw himself into socialist politics with the obsessive intensity of a man who had finally found a vehicle for his ambition. He wrote prolifically, argued with anyone who would engage him, and discovered that he had a natural gift for commanding a room and bending people to his point of view. He was 20 years old and already completely convinced that he was destined for greatness. That certainty was not humility seeking an outlet. It was the same aggressive, self-serving drive that had gotten him expelled from 2 schools, now dressed up in the language of revolution and workers' rights. The cause would change many times throughout his life. The hunger behind it never did. He returned to Italy in 1904 and completed his military service. Not long after, he lost his mother to meningitis at the age of 46. Rosa had been the stabilizing presence in a household that Alessandro's politics had kept permanently unsettled. Her death left a gap that nothing would quite fill, and it removed from Mussolini's life the one voice that had consistently called him toward patience and restraint. By 1909, he was living and working in Trento, at that time still part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire rather than Italy. He wrote for socialist newspapers with a productive fury that would define his relationship with the written word for the rest of his life. He taught himself German in order to read Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in the original. He wrote under the pen name Vero Eretico, the sincere heretic, and the name suited him with an accuracy that he himself probably appreciated. He was a committed socialist in those years. He was fiercely opposed to Italian colonialism, and when Italy invaded Libya in 1911 he protested against it publicly. The man who would later wage his own colonial wars in Africa was, for the moment, an anti-imperialist agitator with a pen and a platform and no power beyond the force of his words. His personal life in these years was equally turbulent. Around the time the war broke out, he had married a woman named Ida Dalser, the daughter of a former mayor of Trento. She had supported him financially during lean periods, and she bore him a son named Benito Albino. But the marriage collapsed quickly. Mussolini divorced Ida in 1915 and almost immediately married Rochelle Guidi, his mistress of several years, with whom he already had a daughter named Etta. Rochelle came from Predapio as well, and her widowed mother had at one point been in a relationship with Mussolini's own father. She would remain married to him, devoted and largely faithful, until the day he died. His treatment of Ida, however, was appalling. After he came to power, he had records of their marriage systematically destroyed. Ida was eventually placed under a form of house arrest and died in 1937 under suspicious circumstances. Their son Benito Albino was committed to an asylum for repeatedly insisting he was Mussolini's legitimate child. He died there in 1942. With Rochelle, Mussolini would have 4 more children over the following years, 3 sons named Vittorio, Bruno, and Romano, and a daughter named Anna Maria. In public, he cultivated the image of the devoted family man and the strong Italian patriarch. In private, he was a serial philanderer on a scale that would only become fully apparent years later. He is known to have fathered at least 9 illegitimate children with 8 different mistresses, and the number of casual relationships ran far beyond that. His last illegitimate child, a daughter named Elena Corti, only passed away in 2022 at the age of 99. And then the First World War arrived, and everything that Mussolini believed, everything he had built his identity around, was tested by the largest conflict the world had ever seen. He had entered the war waving the banner of Marxist socialism, an ideology built on class hatred. He left it having finally dropped the pretense entirely, ready to build something even more brutal and even more honest about its contempt for human freedom. When war broke out in the summer of 1914, his initial position was consistent with his Marxist convictions. He opposed Italian entry into the conflict. The party's newspaper, which he edited, argued loudly for neutrality. But the certainty did not last. Something in him began to shift as the scale and drama of the conflict became impossible to ignore. The war was remaking Europe in real time, and a man of his temperament could not watch from the sidelines without feeling that he was missing the most important event of his generation. In November of 1914, he founded a new newspaper in Milan called Il Popolo d'Italia. Its position was unmistakably and unapologetically pro-war. The Socialist Party expelled him for it. Mussolini walked out of the movement he had devoted his adult life to and never looked back. He volunteered for military service, fought along the Isonzo River against the Austro-Hungarians, was promoted to corporal, and was wounded when a mortar shell exploded near his trench. Dozens of metal fragments lodged in his body. He carried them for the rest of his life. He came back from the trenches a different man. The war had stripped away the theoretical frameworks of his socialist years and left something rawer and more dangerous in their place. The language of class struggle no longer satisfied him. He had watched men die in the mud of the trenches, and what he took from that was not grief or humility. What he took was a blueprint. He had seen how belief could push men past the limits of self-preservation, and he intended to use that knowledge. For him, the international brotherhood of the working class was a fantasy invented by Karl Marx in a library. What was real was power, and Italy with its ancient glory, its Roman blood, its right to dominate. That was the idea he would build everything on now, and he would ask men to die for it with the same cold calculation he had always applied to everything else. And he had already begun to understand, with the instinct of a man who had spent his entire adult life studying the movement of crowds and the psychology of belief, exactly how to make that vision feel like destiny to the millions of Italians who were about to discover how bitterly the peace had betrayed the war they had bled for. The Italy that Mussolini returned to after the war was not the Italy that had sent its young men to die in the trenches. It was a country vibrating with resentment. The peace settlements that followed the armistice had given Italy some of what it had been promised when it entered the war in 1915, but far from all of it. The lands along the eastern Adriatic coast that many Italians considered rightfully theirs had gone instead to the new kingdom of Croats, Serbs, and Slovenes. Albania had been made independent rather than handed to Rome. The sacrifices of 600,000 dead had purchased something that felt, to millions of Italians, like humiliation dressed up as victory. The writer and nationalist politician Gabriele D'Annunzio gave that feeling a name that stuck. He called it the mutilated victory. The phrase spread through Italian political culture like fire through dry grass. It captured something real. It gave shape to a fury that had been looking for a vessel. And Mussolini, watching and calculating from Milan, understood immediately that the man who could channel that fury into organized political force would find himself holding extraordinary power. In March of 1919, he founded the Fasci Italiani di Combattimento in Milan. The name translates roughly as Italian fighting bands. It was deliberately violent. It was deliberately aggressive. It announced from the beginning that this was not a movement interested in parliamentary debate or careful negotiation. It was a movement interested in power, and it intended to take power by whatever means the moment required. The followers of Mussolini's movement quickly became known as the Black Shirts, named for the black uniforms they adopted as a deliberate mark of identity and menace. They formed squads of paramilitary fighters, the squadristi, who moved through the cities and towns of northern Italy with an organized violence that the weak post-war government seemed either unable or unwilling to confront. They attacked socialist organizations, broke up strikes, beat political opponents in the streets, and presented themselves simultaneously as the agents of disorder and the only force capable of restoring order. It was a contradiction that Mussolini understood better than anyone. He had engineered it deliberately. The political landscape of Italy in these years was deeply unstable. Coalition governments rose and fell with exhausting regularity. The parliament was fractured, the economy was struggling, and the threat of communist revolution that had terrified European politics since the Bolshevik seizure of power in Russia in 1917 hung over everything. Factory owners, landowners, and politicians who feared the left looked at the Black Shirts and saw not criminals, but useful muscle. They funded them. They tolerated them. They quietly encouraged them. And Mussolini accepted their support while making absolutely clear, to himself if not always to them, that he had no intention of becoming anyone's instrument. In 1921, he transformed his movement into a formal political party. He called it the Partito Nazionale Fascista, the National Fascist Party. In the general election of that year, running as part of the broader national bloc, his party won 35 seats in parliament. It was a beginning, not a destination. The parliament that resulted from that election was deeply divided and practically ungovernable, and Mussolini recognized the opportunity that chaos represented more clearly than almost anyone else in Italian political life. He escalated. In August of 1922, the Black Shirts effectively seized control of Milan. They attacked socialist organizations across the city, drove out their opponents, and installed their own people in municipal offices. Mussolini's plan was to supplant the socialist among the middle and lower class. The national government in Rome watched and did almost nothing. The inaction was a signal, and Mussolini read it correctly. If the government would not stop him in Milan, it would not stop him anywhere. he began preparing the march on Rome. Units of squadristi were mobilized across the country, gathering from Naples, from Milan, from towns and cities throughout Italy. On the 28th of October 1922, the march began. More than 25,000 blackshirts converged on the capital in a coordinated show of force that was as much theater as it was military operation. Mussolini himself did not lead the march on foot. He appeared at carefully chosen moments, positioned for photographs that would tell the story he wanted told. He was directing the spectacle from a distance, and it worked with a completeness that stunned observers across Europe. King Victor Emmanuel III made his calculation and appointed Mussolini as Prime Minister of Italy on the 30th of October. The following day, with the blackshirts parading through the streets of Rome, the first fascist government in history was formally in place. Mussolini was 39 years old. He had gone from expelled socialist journalist to head of government in less than a decade. The speed of it was unbelievable. The tragic implications of it would take years to fully unfold. He did not seize absolute power immediately. Instead, he moved gradually, tightening his grip through a series of legal and political maneuvers that each, in isolation, could be dismissed by most observers, at the time, as reasonable, but that together formed a systematic dismantling of democratic governance. In 1923, the Acerbo Law was passed, which guaranteed that the party receiving the most votes in an election would automatically receive 2/3 of the parliamentary seats. When a new election was held in April of 1924, Mussolini's party used that law to turn a plurality into an overwhelming majority. The parliament that resulted from it was his parliament. He had not stolen democracy with a single blow. He had made democracy irrelevant by degrees. A socialist deputy named Giacomo Matteotti stood up in parliament and denounced the election as fraudulent. He named names. He cited specific violations. He was brave, and he was right. 2 weeks later, he was murdered by fascist thugs. The killing shocked the country and created a genuine political crisis that threatened, for a brief moment, to end Mussolini's government before it had fully consolidated its power. The opposition parties withdrew from parliament in protest, hoping to delegitimize the government by their absence. Mussolini turned their withdrawal against them. With no opposition present, he moved faster. By 1926, all other political parties had been banned entirely. The transition to a one-party dictatorship was complete. He was Il Duce now, the leader. The title appeared everywhere. Newspapers were censored to reflect the image he wanted projected. The phrase Il Duce ha sempre ragione, the leader is always right, became a kind of daily incantation. His photograph appeared in public spaces throughout the country. His speeches were broadcast, his athletic exploits were celebrated, his youth was emphasized. He had seized power at an age when many politicians were still building their careers, and the propaganda machine made sure that Italians never forgot it. In 1927, he established the Opera Vigilanza Repressione Antifascismo, the Organization for Vigilance and Repression of Anti-Fascism, known by its acronym OVRA. It was the first fascist secret police in Europe. At its height, it employed around 50,000 operatives. It conducted thousands of raids and interrogations every week. It created an atmosphere of terror in such a way that ordinary Italians learned to watch what they said, to be careful who they trusted, and to understand that the state was watching and ready to strike with fury and oppression against its own citizens. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the Nazi SS, would later travel to Italy specifically to study the OVRA in action. The organization Mussolini built became a model that the Nazis and Soviets refined and expanded into something even more terrible. The cult of personality extended beyond politics into culture and sport. In 1928, construction began on the Foro Mussolini in central Rome, a vast sports complex modeled on the forums of the Roman emperors, complete with stadiums and training facilities. Sport was not entertainment under fascism. It was a vehicle for national identity, propaganda, and a demonstration of Italian vitality. In 1934, the FIFA World Cup was held in Italy, and the Italian national team won it on home soil, defeating Czechoslovakia in the final. They won it again in France in 1938. The victories fed the myth of a nation reborn under fascist leadership. They were useful, and Mussolini made full use of them. The economy offered him both opportunities and limits. He had come to power partly because of the economic and political chaos of the post-war years. He benefited enormously from the fact that his arrival coincided with the broader European economic recovery of the 1920s, a period of genuine growth that the fascist government was happy to take credit for. He introduced protectionist measures, raised tariffs on foreign imports, and promoted domestic industry. One genuinely lasting achievement was the draining of the Pontine marshes south of Rome, a vast swampland that had been a breeding ground for malaria for thousands of years. The project created new towns and reclaimed productive land. Unfortunately, it was a real accomplishment that was used to water down the repression of the fascist government. But when the Great Depression arrived and devastated the Italian economy just as badly as every other economy in Europe, the myth of fascism as a superior economic system was exposed. Mussolini responded with mass state takeovers of industry. It would take until the mid-1950s before Italy recovered the economic output it had achieved before the Depression began. While he was building his political and economic empire through censorship and repression, he was also building something considerably more personal. In 1932, driving along the coast in a red Alfa Romeo, Mussolini caught the eye of a young woman named Clara Petacci. She was 20 years old. He was 48. Clara had been an admirer of Mussolini since her teenage years, with a devotion that went beyond ordinary political enthusiasm into something that bordered on obsession. She had written in her diary at 14, after an assassination attempt on him, asking why she had not been by his side to stop it. When they met on that coastal road, the encounter ignited something that neither of them would walk away from. Clara came from a wealthy and respectable family. Her father was a doctor connected to the Vatican. She had married an Air Force officer named Riccardo Federici in 1934, but the marriage was already a formality before it had fully begun. By 1936, she had formally separated from her husband and devoted herself entirely to the relationship she had spent years building toward. After 1937, she was a regular presence at the Palazzo Venezia, visiting Mussolini in the private apartments he maintained there, and the two spoke on the telephone every day for hours at a time. Mussolini rewarded her devotion with a generosity that was itself a form of corruption. He arranged a luxurious villa for her, a substantial allowance, clothing from Paris, and privileges that ordinary Italians living through the austerity of the 1930s could not have imagined. He helped her father advance his career, supported her brother's ambitions, hired her uncle as an official painter, and opened doors in the Italian film industry for her younger sister. The Petacci family became, in effect, a secondary household operating in the shadow of the official fascist state, maintained by public power for private purposes. His wife Rochelle knew. She endured it with the silent dignity of a woman who understood that the marriage she had made was not the marriage she had imagined, and who chose to stay whether because of the benefits of being First Lady or the fear of meeting the same fate as Mussolini's first wife, Ida Dalser. She would remain at his side, devoted and unbroken, as the fascist regime propaganda portrayed her, until the end. But it was Clara who occupied the private center of Mussolini's life in those final years. It was Clara who would choose, when the moment of decision came, to follow him into the darkness rather than save herself. Beyond his personal entanglements, Mussolini was building an empire in Africa with the same systematic disregard for human life that characterized everything else his regime undertook. Italy had held nominal control over Libya since 1911, but the country remained unstable and resistant. Between 1923 and 1932, the so-called pacification of Libya was carried out with a brutality typical of supremacist regimes, not unlike what the Soviets did to the Ukrainians during the Holodomor, or what the Nazis did during the invasion of Poland. Chemical weapons were used. Concentration camps were established. Ethnic laws were introduced forbidding intermarriage between Italians and the Arab and Berber population. Thousands of Italian settlers were brought in to colonize land taken from its original inhabitants. Bedouin and Berber communities were forcibly relocated in what constituted a program of ethnic cleansing. Around 50,000 native Libyans are estimated to have been killed. The precise figure is impossible to establish with certainty, but the scale of the violence is not in doubt. With Libya secured, Mussolini turned his ambitions toward the Horn of Africa. Italy already held colonies in Eritrea and Somaliland, But between them lay the Ethiopian Empire, one of the last independent African nations never to have been colonized. In October of 1935, Italian forces invaded Ethiopia. The Second Italo-Ethiopian War lasted nearly a year and a half and ended with the Italian conquest of the country, though with considerable difficulty and at a cost that exposed serious weaknesses in the Italian military that would become even more apparent in the years ahead. Both sides committed atrocities. The Italians used mustard gas. Civilians were massacred. International law was disregarded with a casualness that reflected how completely the League of Nations had lost its authority to enforce anything. Mussolini's racial views were not identical to those of the Nazis, but they were not benign. He rejected Hitler's rigid racial hierarchy as intellectually incoherent for a continent where populations had intermingled for thousands of years. He was on record praising the contributions of Jewish Italians to the country's war effort. He had Jewish lovers and Jewish political associates. Around 10,000 Jews were members of his own fascist party by 1932, and prominent Jewish figures held senior positions in his government. But his views on black Africans were something else entirely. He made repeated statements about birth rates, about racial competition between white and black populations, and his conduct in Libya and Ethiopia was that of a man who regarded the lives of African people as entirely expendable in the service of Italian fascist imperial ambitions. The Italian fascist regime would not adopt formal anti-Semitic legislation until the late 1930s, after the alliance with Germany had deepened. But the brutality of Italy's colonial wars had been there from the beginning. In 1936, while the fighting in Ethiopia was still ongoing, the Spanish Civil War erupted. A right-wing nationalist faction under General Francisco Franco was fighting a left-leaning communist Republican government, and Mussolini threw his support behind Franco with a conviction rooted in strategic calculation as much as ideological solidarity. A fascist-aligned Spain would give Italy significant influence over the Western Mediterranean. He committed real resources to the effort. The Italian Corpo Truppe Voluntari reached 50,000 men at its height. The Royal Italian Navy played a critical role in breaking a Republican blockade. Franco won, and in the process of winning, Mussolini had begun, for the first time, to act in close coordination with the other major fascist power in Europe. Adolf Hitler had come to power in Germany in 1933, and the common assumption that Mussolini immediately embraced him as a natural ally is not accurate. For much of the 1930s, Mussolini was actually skeptical of a German alliance. The central issue was Austria. Italy had territorial claims on the South Tyrol region bordering its northern frontier, and German ambitions toward Austria represented a direct threat to Italian interests in that area. When the Nazis attempted to seize control of Vienna through various means between 1933 and 1938, Mussolini backed the Austrian government against them. The two men had first met in Venice in 1934, and the encounter revealed more than either would have liked. Mussolini sat through Hitler's racial monologues with barely concealed boredom, privately considering them the obsessive ramblings of a second-rate mind. Hitler was visibly deferential toward a man he had spent years studying from a distance. It was not a meeting of equals, and neither man left it particularly impressed by the other. The relationship shifted gradually. By 1937, with Mussolini needing German backing for his African campaigns and both powers cooperating in Spain, understanding was reached. Mussolini would not resist German annexation of Austria, provided Hitler made no claims on the territories Italy had obtained from the old Austro-Hungarian Empire at the end of the First World War. With that agreement in place, Hitler annexed Austria in March of 1938. At the Munich Conference in September of that year, convened over German claims to the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, Mussolini served as the chief translator, fluent in French and functional in both German and English. He played a subtle but real role in facilitating the agreement that Britain and France hoped would prevent a larger war. If you are enjoying this video, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for supporting this channel. Your like really helps keep this project alive. If you can, leave a super chat. Any amount will help us a lot. Thanks. It did not prevent anything. 6 months after Munich, Germany swallowed the rest of Czechoslovakia. Europe was moving toward catastrophe, and Mussolini, standing at the edge of it, was about to make the decision that would ultimately cost him everything. Italy entered the Second World War on the 10th of June, 1940, and the moment Mussolini chose to make that declaration was one of the most consequential miscalculations in modern European history. France had been crumbling for weeks beneath the German assault. Paris would fall within days. To Mussolini, watching from Rome with the impatience of a man who had spent his entire political life preparing for exactly this kind of historic turning point, the war appeared to be ending before Italy had the chance to claim its share of the spoils. He did not want to arrive at the peace table as a spectator. He wanted to arrive as a conqueror. What he did not fully reckon with was that France, even in its collapse, was not finished. Italian forces attacked across the Alpine frontier in mid-June and made almost no progress at all. The French defenders, outnumbered and fighting a war that had already been lost elsewhere, held the Italian advance to a matter of kilometers. It was an embarrassment that Mussolini buried beneath the grandeur of his public rhetoric propaganda. But the people who ran the Italian military saw it clearly. The gap between the army Mussolini described in his speeches and the army that actually existed in the field was not a small discrepancy. It was a chasm, and the years ahead would make that chasm impossible to hide. The military disasters for nefarious regime came in waves. In the autumn of 1940, without consulting Hitler or coordinating a joint strategy, Mussolini ordered an Italian invasion of Greece launched from Italian-controlled Albania. It was a decision born of wounded pride as much as strategic calculation. He was tired of Hitler acting without warning him in advance, and he intended to demonstrate that Italy could wage its own independent campaigns. He famously told one of his advisors that he would send Hitler his resignation if the Greeks resisted. The Greeks resisted. The Greek army not only stopped the Italian advance, but pushed it back into Albanian territory, inflicting a humiliation so complete and so public that it reverberated across the continent. Germany eventually intervened and invaded Greece itself, a diversion that many historians believe critically delayed the German invasion of the Soviet Union by several crucial weeks. In North Africa, the picture was no better. Italian forces initially advanced from Libya into Egypt in the autumn of 1940, pushing toward the British position at Alexandria. The British counterattack shattered the Italian advance with a completeness that shocked both sides. Operation Compass, launched in December of 1940, destroyed 10 Italian divisions and captured 130,000 prisoners in a matter of weeks. The entire Italian position in North Africa collapsed so rapidly that Germany was again forced to help Mussolini. The Nazi German General Erwin Rommel arrived in Libya in February of 1941 with the Afrika Korps, and suddenly the Desert War became something different entirely. The Italian military was fighting alongside one of the most gifted operational commanders of the 20th century, and Rommel could not hide his contempt for the leadership of the forces he was nominally supporting. He was so effective and so relentless in his tactics that even his enemies respected him deeply. The British soldiers fighting against him in the desert gave him a nickname that no Allied commander ever received from the other side. They called him the Desert Fox, and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill himself stood up in the House of Commons and acknowledged Rommel as a great general who treated prisoners of war with dignity, which is something that, even today, leads critics to accuse Rommel of lending respectability to a nefarious regime that deserved none. His reputation as an honorable soldier has never fully shielded him from the debate that surrounds his role within the Nazi German war machine, and historians remain divided over whether a man of his ability and influence could truly claim ignorance of the crimes being committed by the regime he served. The victories that followed in North Africa were overwhelmingly German victories. The Italian contribution was frequently treated as a liability to be managed rather than a strength to be deployed. In East Africa, the Italian imperial possessions in Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Somaliland were lost entirely by November of 1941. The empire that Mussolini had announced with such fanfare in 1936 had lasted less than 5 years. The Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie, whom Italy had driven into exile, returned to his throne. The photographs of his return circulated widely. They were the first clear and unmistakable images of the gap between the fascist propaganda and reality. Through all of this, Mussolini continued to govern, to broadcast his propaganda and command. He managed public appearances and press coverage with the practiced precision of a man who had understood the power could deceive an entire nation. But the effort was taking a visible toll. Those who worked closely with him in these years noticed a man who was no longer operating with the restless energy that had defined the nefarious fascist leader throughout the 1920s and 30s. He was increasingly unwell. He suffered from chronic stomach problems that had plagued him for years and were worsening under the pressure of the war. His doctors attributed the condition to a combination of stress and a stomach ulcer. The treatments prescribed were largely ineffective, and Mussolini's physical deterioration became a subject of private discussion among both Italian officials and foreign observers. The relationship with Hitler continued to evolve in ways that were deeply uncomfortable for the man who had once been the elder statesman of European fascism. By 1942, the dynamic between the two leaders had shifted almost entirely. Hitler no longer visited Italy as a respectful ally paying his respects to Mussolini. He arrived as a dominant partner who expected deference and generally received it. At their meetings, Hitler's monologues stretched for hours. Mussolini sat and listened, in a way that the man who had held Italian audiences spellbound in his personal propaganda for 2 decades would never have tolerated from anyone. The power between the dictators had shifted. The center of gravity of the fascist dictatorship had moved from Rome to Berlin, and there was nothing Mussolini could do to reverse it without ending the alliance entirely. His relationship with Clara Petacci continued through these years. She remained in Rome, living in the villa he had arranged for her, receiving his daily phone calls, and maintaining the emotional intimacy that had become, in its way, the most stable relationship in his life. Rochelle remained at their family home in the Romagna, stoic and clear-eyed about what the marriage had become. Clara was 28 years younger than Mussolini and deeply in love with him in a way that his other mistresses had not been. She was possessive, sometimes emotionally volatile, and completely unwilling to consider a life apart from him. He kept her close, not because he was capable of the kind of fidelity she deserved, but because she gave him something that political power had never quite provided. She believed in him without conditions. And as the war began to strip away every other source of certainty in his life, that unconditional belief became something the Italian dictator was not willing to live without. The turning point that would ultimately bring the entire structure down arrived in the summer of 1943. The Allied invasion of Sicily began on the 9th of July, and within 2 weeks the island was effectively in Allied hands. It was the first piece of European soil occupied by fascist Italy that had been retaken by Allied forces, and the psychological impact inside Italy was enormous. The invasion made something real that had previously been theoretical. The war had come to Italy itself. The question was no longer whether Italy could win. The question was whether the regime could survive. Inside the higher levels of Italian fascism, a conspiracy had been forming for months. Senior members of the Fascist Grand Council, some of whom had been loyal to Mussolini for decades, had concluded that the only way to extract Italy from the catastrophe was to remove Mussolini from power and seek a separate peace with the Allies. The man who became the central figure in this effort was Dino Grandi, one of Mussolini's oldest political associates, who had served as foreign minister and as ambassador to Britain. Grandi drafted a resolution that would effectively strip Mussolini of his military command and restore authority to the king. The meeting of the Fascist Grand Council on the night of the 24th of July, 1943, was among the most dramatic in the history of 20th century politics. It began in the early evening and lasted until nearly 3 in the morning. Mussolini arrived knowing that something was planned but convinced, with the characteristic arrogance of a man who had held absolute power for 20 years, that he could manage it. He could not. The debate was bitter, extended, and at times personal. Grandi presented his resolution and spoke with the passion of a man who understood that what he was doing might cost him his life. Others followed with arguments that ranged from principled disagreement to obvious self-preservation. When the vote was taken, 19 members of the council voted in favor of the resolution. 7 voted against. 1 abstained. The result was not merely a political defeat. It was a public repudiation by the men who had helped build Italian fascism, carried out inside the most sacred institutional chamber of the dictatorship they had built together. Mussolini seemed almost not to understand what had happened. He left the meeting and returned home. The following day, he went to his usual appointment with the king at the Villa Savoia. Victor Emmanuel received him, informed him that Marshal Pietro Badoglio had been appointed the new prime minister, and thanked him for his services to the country. The conversation lasted less than half an hour. When Mussolini emerged from the villa, a military ambulance was waiting. He was arrested on the spot. The man who had transformed Italy into a totalitarian dictatorship for more than 2 decades was taken away in a vehicle designed to conceal rather than honor what was happening. He was driven first to a carabinieri barracks in Rome, then transported under heavy guard to the island of Ponza off the Tyrrhenian coast. Italy's most famous political dictator had become Italy's most famous prisoner. The news of his arrest was announced that evening. The popular reaction across Italy was not grief. It was relief. Crowds poured into the streets and cities throughout the country. Fascist symbols were torn down. Portraits of Mussolini were removed from public buildings. 20 years of enforced public devotion evaporated in a matter of hours with a completeness that was itself a revelation about the nature of that devotion. It had not been genuine love. It had been compliance shaped by fear and by the absence of any alternative. The moment the fear was removed, the compliance dissolved instantly. He was moved from Ponza to the island of La Maddalena off the Sardinian coast, and from there, in August of 1943, he was transferred to a mountain hotel called Campo Imperatore, high in the Gran Sasso range of the Apennines, accessible only by cable car. It was as remote a location as the Italian mainland offered. The Badoglio government was negotiating secretly with the Allies, and the new government wanted Mussolini somewhere that neither the Germans nor any potential fascist loyalists could easily reach him. They had underestimated Hitler. The German Führer was furious at the fall of Mussolini and immediately ordered that his ally be found and liberated. He assigned the operation to Otto Skorzeny, a Nazi German special operations commander. On the 12th of September, 1943, 8 days after Italy had formally signed an armistice with the Allies, Skorzeny led a force of German paratroopers and SS commandos in a daring glider assault on the Campo Imperatore Hotel. The gliders landed on the rocky slope immediately adjacent to the building with precision. The Italian guards, uncertain whether to fire on Axis soldiers, surrendered without significant resistance. Mussolini was brought out of the hotel to find Skorzeny standing in front of him. He is reported to have said that he knew his friend Adolf Hitler would not abandon him. Whatever he actually felt in that moment, the image of the rescued dictator was exactly what German propaganda required. He was flown to Vienna, then to Munich, and then to Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia, where the two dictators met for what would be their final in-person encounter. Those who observed the meeting noted the contrast between the two. Hitler was energized, voluble, convinced that the war could still be won, outlining plans for a German counteroffensive with the manic confidence of a totalitarian dictator detached from operational reality. Mussolini was hollow. He had aged visibly during his imprisonment. The restless, dominating energy that had defined him for decades had gone somewhere, and what remained was a tired and defeated old man going through the motions of a performance he no longer believed in. Hitler wanted Mussolini to return to Italy and establish a new fascist government in the territories still controlled by Germany. He needed the legitimacy that Mussolini's name still provided. Mussolini accepted. He had no real alternative. To refuse would have been to accept obscurity, and obscurity was something that a deranged dictator had always feared more than death. The Italian Social Republic was established in September of 1943, with its administrative capital in the town of Salo on the western shore of Lake Garda in northern Italy. It was called, by its critics and eventually by historians, the Republic of Salo. In theory, it was an independent Italian state. In practice, it was a German occupation zone with Italian administrative functions. The Germans controlled everything that actually mattered. They controlled the military operations, the rail lines, the industrial production, and the ultimate decisions about territory and population. Mussolini presided over a government that could organize propaganda and administer civil functions in areas the Germans found it convenient to delegate. It was a puppet regime, and Mussolini accepted that role without hesitation, lending his name and his face to a German occupation that was actively hunting down Italian Jews and sending them to be exterminated. He had spent 20 years destroying Italy's democracy, and now he was finishing the job as Hitler's puppet. He knew it. People around him in those final months reported a man who would slip into extended silences in the middle of conversations, who spent hours at his desk staring at documents without reading them, and who spoke with a resignation that no amount of public performance could quite conceal. He made speeches. He gave interviews, including a lengthy one to a journalist named Madeleine Mollier that was widely republished, and in which he sounded more like a dictator reviewing his allegedly legacy than a leader planning his future. He said, in various ways and across multiple conversations during this period, that everything was finished. He held the belief and the fatalism simultaneously. The first act of vengeance that the Republic of Salo carried out was against the men who had voted to remove him from power in July of 1943. Several members of the Fascist Grand Council were arrested and tried before a special tribunal in Verona in January of 1944. It was, just like so many other trials during Mussolini's dictatorship, a show trial conducted by a kangaroo court where the verdict had been decided long before anyone sat down in that room. The proceedings were cursory. The outcome was predetermined. 5 of the men who had voted against Mussolini were condemned to death, including his own son-in-law, Count Galeazzo Ciano. Ciano had been Mussolini's foreign minister for years and had married his daughter Etta in 1930. He was intelligent, ambitious, morally flexible in ways that fascist service rewarded, and he had been deeply close to his father-in-law for most of his adult life. After the Grand Council vote, he had tried to flee to Spain via Germany, but the Germans had handed him back to the Italian fascist authorities for execution. His wife Etta made desperate personal appeals to her father to spare her husband's life. She threatened, in writing, to publish Ciano's private diaries, which contained embarrassing material about Mussolini and about Hitler. Mussolini did not intervene. On the 11th of January, 1944, Galeazzo Ciano and 4 other condemned men were executed by firing squad in Verona. They were shot in the back, tied to chairs, which was considered a mark of dishonor. Etta never forgave her father. She managed to smuggle the diaries out of Italy, and they were eventually published after the war, providing one of the most detailed insider accounts of the fascist dictatorship ever produced. The execution of Ciano shocked many observers because it revealed something about Mussolini that his public image had always worked to obscure. Whatever warmth or sentimentality he displayed in public was, at its core, false. Made by personal propaganda. The man who had built a dictatorship on the rhetoric of Italian family values had signed the death warrant of his own daughter's husband. He had done it without apparent hesitation. He had done it because the political logic of retribution demanded it, and because he had never, in the end, allowed personal bonds to override the imperatives of his power and personal revenge. By the autumn of 1944, the military situation in Italy had become irreversible. The Allied forces had fought their way up the peninsula through the spring and summer at enormous cost, breaking through defensive lines that the Germans had constructed with the professionalism and determination of an army that was retreating but far from broken. Rome had fallen in June of 1944. Florence followed in August. By autumn, the Allies were pressing against the Gothic Line, the final major German defensive position in northern Italy, and the question was no longer whether they would break through, but when. Mussolini's government at Salo continued to function in the diminishing sense that a government without real authority can be said to function. He gave orders that were frequently ignored by the Germans. He made appointments to positions that had no real power. He received visitors and held meetings and maintained the external forms of leadership in a situation that had ceased to have any substance. The Germans continued to need his name and face. They did not need anything else he had to offer. His health had deteriorated further. He had lost significant weight. The gastric problems that had troubled him for years had worsened, and the physical vitality that had been such a central part of his public image was entirely gone. Those who met him in those final months described a figure that bore almost no resemblance to the man who had filled stadiums with his physical presence and commanded the attention of millions through regime propaganda. What remained was a kind of ghost, still performing the rituals of leadership while understanding, with complete clarity, that the performance had lost all meaning. Clara Petacci had joined him at his residence on Lake Garda in the autumn of 1943. She had refused all offers to leave Italy for a safer country. She had refused to consider separating herself from a man whose position was becoming more dangerous with every passing month. She was in her early 30s. She had every possibility of survival available to her. She chose to remain. Rochelle was also present in the area, living nearby with their children, maintaining her own fierce and complicated loyalty to the fascist dictator. In the final weeks of April 1945, as the Allied advance broke through the last German defenses and partisan resistance throughout northern Italy erupted into open conflict, the entire Nazi and fascist structure in Italy began to collapse with the speed of something that had been held together by nothing more than the fear of what would happen when it fell. The end, when it finally came fast. By the final days of April 1945, the nefarious world that Mussolini had spent more than 2 decades constructing had ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. The German forces in Italy were in open collapse. Partisan units were seizing cities across the north. Milan was rising. Turin was rising. The industrial heartland of the country that he had governed for so long was being liberated by the very working-class movements he had spent his entire political career trying to destroy. The irony was total, and there is every reason to believe that he understood it. He had spent his final weeks at the Palazzo della Prefettura in Milan, attempting to negotiate with leaders of the Italian resistance, hoping to find some arrangement that would prevent a complete and violent collapse of everything that remained of his authority. The negotiations went nowhere. The partisan leadership had no interest in a settlement that left Mussolini with any form of political life. They wanted unconditional surrender, and they wanted him. He knew what that meant. He had spent 20 years persecuting, imprisoning, and executing his political enemies, and he was not naive about what awaited him if he fell into the hands of the people who had survived what his regime had done to them. There were discussions during these final days about various escape routes. Switzerland was the obvious destination. Emissaries were sent to explore whether the Swiss government would grant him asylum. The answer came back negative. Spain was discussed. Portugal was discussed. Argentina, which had already become a destination for fleeing fascists and would shelter many more in the months ahead, was mentioned. None of it led anywhere concrete. Time had simply run out faster than any of the plans being made could accommodate. On the 25th of April, 1945, the National Liberation Committee for Northern Italy formally declared a general insurrection. The order went out to every partisan unit in the region. The moment that Mussolini and everyone around him had been dreading had arrived. He left Milan that night in a convoy heading north along the western shore of Lake Como, toward the Swiss border. The convoy included German soldiers, fascist officials, and a scattering of people connected to the regime in various ways. Clara Petacci, who had been staying at a villa near Monza, somehow made her way to join the convoy before it had traveled far. She had once again been offered safety. She had once again refused it. The convoy moved through the night and into the morning of the 26th of April, stopping at various points as the roads ahead were checked for partisan activity. At the town of Menaggio, the German commander of the convoy received word that partisan forces were blocking the road further north. The convoy halted for hours. During this pause, Mussolini is believed to have sheltered briefly at the local fascist headquarters, though the accounts of exactly what happened during those hours are complicated by the conflicting testimonies of the various survivors who later told their versions of events. What is not in dispute is that by the time the convoy moved again, it had grown larger and more disorganized, and the situation on the roads ahead was becoming increasingly dangerous. On the morning of the 27th of April, the convoy reached the town of Dongo, on the western shore of the lake, and there it was stopped by a partisan roadblock. The partisans who conducted the stop were members of the 52nd Garibaldi Brigade, a communist-aligned partisan formation, and their commanding officers were Luigi Bellini del Stelle. The Germans in the convoy were allowed through after negotiations, because the partisans had no desire to provoke a pitched battle with German soldiers when the war was effectively already over. The Italian fascists in the convoy were a different matter entirely. As the search of the convoy proceeded, one of the partisans noticed something unusual about one of the German military trucks near the rear of the column. A figure in a German military overcoat was huddled in the back, facing away from the road, apparently sleeping or trying to appear asleep. The coat was too large. Something about the figure did not look right. The partisans ordered the truck to stop and demanded that the figure turn around. When he did, the partisan who had ordered the search recognized him immediately, despite the coat, despite the unfamiliar posture of a man reduced from absolute power to something crouching in the back of a truck in the hope that no one would notice him. If you are enjoying this video, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for supporting this channel. Your like really helps keep this project alive. If you can, leave a super chat. Any amount will help us a lot. Thanks. Benito Mussolini, Illinois Duce, the man who had marched on Rome, who had invaded Ethiopia, who had stood on the balcony of the Palazzo Venezia before crowds of hundreds of thousands and declared the rebirth of the Roman Empire, was hiding under a German military greatcoat in the back of a truck at a partisan roadblock. He was taken off the truck and placed in custody. He did not resist. By multiple accounts, he seemed not entirely surprised. He is reported to have said, quietly, that he had known it would end this way. Clara Petacci, who had been traveling in another vehicle, was also identified and taken into custody. She could have claimed to be uninvolved. There were witnesses prepared to help her maintain that story. She refused. She insisted on being held with Mussolini. She was 33 years old, and she had been trying to stay by his side for more than a decade. She was not going to stop now. The partisans moved their prisoners through several locations during what remained of that day and into the night. There was genuine uncertainty about what to do next and real fear that a German counteroperation to liberate Mussolini was possible. The Germans had rescued him once already. The partisans were taking no chances. By the late evening of the 27th of April, Mussolini and Clara had been taken to a farmhouse in the small village of Giuliano di Mezzegra, on the hillside above the lake, and placed in the custody of a local farmer named Luigi de Maria and his wife. They were given a room together. They spent the night there. It was the last night either of them would ever see. The question of exactly what happened in the hours that followed has generated more historical controversy than almost any other episode of the entire Second World War in Italy. What is established beyond reasonable dispute is this. On the afternoon of the 28th of April, 1945, a man arrived at the De Maria farmhouse with orders to execute Mussolini. That man was Walter Audizio, a communist partisan commander who operated under the name Colonel Valerio. He was accompanied by Luigi Longo and a small group of armed men. The authorization for the execution came from the communist partisan leadership, and the exact chain of command that produced the order has been disputed ever since. Audizio arrived and informed Mussolini that he had come to liberate him. It is not clear whether Mussolini believed this, even for a moment. The circumstances were not those of a liberation. He and Clara were taken outside and led to the gate of the Villa Belmonte, a property immediately adjacent to the farmhouse on the Via Giuliano. The location was chosen for its seclusion. There was no audience. There were no photographers. There was no formal proceeding of any kind. What happened at the gate of the Villa Belmonte was not a trial and not an execution in any legal sense. It was a killing, carried out quickly, in a place chosen because it could not be easily observed. Mussolini stood before Walter Audizio. By some accounts, he was ordered to stand against the stone wall. By others, he was still moving when the shooting began. Audizio raised his weapon, a submachine gun, and fired. The weapon jammed on the first attempt. He seized another gun from one of the men beside him and fired again. Mussolini fell. He was shot multiple times. The precise number of shots and their exact sequence have been described differently by the various people who claim to have been present. What is not disputed is that he died there, at the gate of the Villa Belmonte in Giuliano di Mezzegra, in the middle of the afternoon on the 28th of April 1945. Clara Petacci died alongside him. The accounts of her final moments are among the most debated details of the entire event. Some versions hold that she threw herself in front of Mussolini when the shooting started, attempting physically to shield him with her own body. Others suggest that she was simply shot without warning as part of the same operation. The Italian partisan leadership never provided a fully consistent account of what happened to her, and the inconsistencies have fed decades of speculation. What is certain is that she died at the same location, at approximately the same time, and that she had been given the opportunity to walk away and had not taken it. Whatever she felt for Mussolini, whatever complicated and tragic thing their relationship had been, it had carried her to the end of everything. Their bodies were loaded onto a truck along with the bodies of several other senior fascists who had been captured and executed in the same general operation. The truck drove south through the night toward Milan. It arrived in the early hours of the 29th of April, and the bodies were deposited in the Piazzale Loreto, a large public square in the eastern part of the city. The location had been chosen with deliberate symbolic intent. In August of 1944, 15 Italian partisans had been executed at Piazzale Loreto by Fascist and German forces, and their bodies had been left in the square as a public warning. The partisans who chose to bring Mussolini's body to the same place were making a statement that required no explanation. By the morning of the 29th, a crowd had gathered around the bodies. What happened next was deeply disturbing, and those who have written about it have generally agreed that it represented something real and ugly about what 20 years of totalitarianism and years of brutal war had done to Italian society. The crowd surged forward. People struck the bodies, kicked them, spat on them. Women who had lost sons and husbands in Mussolini's persecution screamed at the corpse of the man they held responsible. The display of public hatred was raw and uncontrolled in a way that made many observers, even those who had every reason to despise Mussolini, deeply uncomfortable. At some point during the morning, the bodies of Mussolini and Clara Petacci, along with several others, were strung up by their heels from the metal canopy of a half-demolished gas station at the edge of the square. The image that resulted was published in newspapers around the world within days and became one of the defining photographs of the entire war. Mussolini, the nefarious dictator who had spent decades crafting his image with extraordinary precision, who had controlled every photograph, every newsreel, every public appearance to project physical power and derange authority, ended as an inverted corpse in a city square while a crowd threw things at him. A suitable end for the fascist dictator who sent thousands to their deaths, ordered executions and torture, sent thousands to concentration camps, and orchestrated a campaign of racial cleansing. Adolf Hitler, in his underground bunker in Berlin, received the news of Mussolini's death on the 29th of April. He had already made up his mind about his own fate. He did not intend to be captured. He did not intend to be displayed in any public square. Hitler died by his own hand in Berlin on the 30th of April, less than 24 hours after Mussolini's body was hung from a gas station beam in Milan. Germany surrendered unconditionally 1 week later. The war in Europe was finally over. Mussolini's body was eventually cut down and taken to the city morgue, where it was examined and photographed extensively. In the years that followed, the question of where he should be buried became a strange and protracted controversy in itself. His body was initially stored in an unmarked location to prevent his grave from becoming a fascist shrine. In 1957, after years of petitions by his family, the Italian government finally permitted his remains to be returned to his hometown of Predoppio and buried in the family crypt. The crypt in Predoppio remains, to this day, a site of annual pilgrimage by Italian and international neo-fascists, who gather there each year on the anniversaries of his birth, his death, and the March on Rome. The Italian government has repeatedly debated whether to restrict or ban the gatherings. The debate has never been fully resolved. Rachel Mussolini survived him by more than 3 decades. She was briefly imprisoned after the war, but was released without trial. She ran a restaurant and a small hotel in Predoppio in the years that followed, raised her children, and wrote a memoir in which she defended the dictator's legacy. She died in 1979 at the age of 89. His daughter Etta, who had never forgiven him for allowing Galeazzo Ciano to be executed, lived until 1995. She gave interviews in her later years that were frank, bitter, and illuminating in equal measure. She confirmed what many had suspected, that the man who had portrayed himself as Il Duce, the embodiment of fascist, had been, in private, a far more conflicted and uncertain figure than the image his regime had manufactured. She described a father capable of genuine affection and genuine cruelty, sometimes within the same conversation. Like so many others whose lives were destroyed by that monster and his oppressive regime, she never forgave him.